Hello and welcome to the 741 channel. Thank you for stopping by. Today we're going to take a look at replacing the air conditioning belt tensioner on this 2004 Chevy Tahoe. Now while I'm at it, I'm going to replace the main serpentine belt, its tensioner, and its idler pulley as well. So right now the tensioner is kind of behaving itself. You'll hear it start to chirp a little bit as the air conditioning compressor kicks on and off. Now sometimes when I'm driving around, especially if it's hot and the air conditioner is under a lot of load, that thing will start squealing quite loudly and make all kinds of noises. The first thing I'm going to do before we get started with the repair is disconnect the battery. The next thing that I'm going to do is remove this air snorkel that's held on by a hose clamp over here where the air box is, and then one right here underneath this cover on top of the engine. I'm also going to remove this cover from the top of the engine. That's just held on with one bolt up here. So I'll use an 8mm socket and pull that off. With those hose clamps loosened up but not completely removed, we should be able to pull the snorkel off of here. Next thing I'm going to do is remove the fan shroud to give myself a little more access to the belt area. So there's just two bolts that hold the fan shroud onto the radiator support, one here and one here. I'm going to use a 10mm socket to remove those. There's also a few clips holding these hoses in place that I'll have to deal with, but those will just pop right out. There's also two plastic clips down here on the bottom of the fan shroud. It actually holds the top fan shroud to the bottom piece, so we're going to need to pop those to get this top half off. I'm just going to use my pin popping tool to do that. Here's a quick look at the plastic pin that holds the two halves of the fan shroud together. You can see I just put my tool in there to work up that center piece, pulls it up, and then these just come right out. And I almost didn't see them, but there's actually two clips on either side. One here closer to the engine and one back by the radiator. So with all the clips out of the way, we should be able to just kind of maneuver things around and pull the top half of the fan shroud out of the engine bay. The bottom half of the radiator shroud is still in the engine, but it is kind of loose and flopping around. There just doesn't seem to be quite enough clearance to pull that out without removing the fan. So I'm going to leave it in there for now. The next step is to remove the serpentine belt. Now before doing that, I like to take a few pictures of it from different angles just so I have a reference of how the belt is routed. Now on this particular vehicle, I do have a belt routing diagram right on the radiator shroud, so that will be helpful as well. So I've got my breaker bar with a 15mm socket on the end of it. So what I'm going to do now is put this on the stud that's on the tensioner pulley right here. And then to release the tension and remove the belt from the engine, all we have to do is push this clockwise, or like we were tightening a bolt, and it releases the tension on the tensioner and the belt can slip off. Okay, so here's a closer look at the belt. Now it's not in horrible shape, there's no major signs of damage anywhere on it, but you can see it's pretty worn and it looks pretty old. It's got some cracking and checking and it just feels kind of stiff. Definitely time to get rid of this belt. I'm going to go freehand with the camera here for a minute, so I apologize if this gets a little bit shaky. What we're looking at here is the air conditioning belt, and I'm going to remove that next. You can see it comes off the main engine crank over here on the right. There's the idler pulley, which is the root of the problem here today, down there below my finger. And then over to the left is the air conditioning compressor. Now we're under the truck, and what I'm going to do to give myself more access to the air conditioning belt and tensioner is I'm going to remove this front plastic shroud and that skid plate that's back there. These are both held on with bolts that will require a 15mm socket, so I'm just going to remove all of those now. Looks like there's a couple here, a couple in the front of the skid plate, one or two back there, and then I know there's three on the front of this plastic shroud. So we're back under the front of the truck again. You can see I've got the skid plate off to the side. I didn't take it all the way off. Left one bolt in there just to kind of hold it up and pivot it over. But I do have this front plastic piece completely off the truck and out of the way. So up there is the air conditioning tensioner, and you can see there's a square hole in the end of it. I'm not exactly sure what size hole that is in the end of the tensioner, but I'm going to use my 3/8" ratchet with a short extension on, and I'm going to put that in that hole. You can see it's kind of a loose fit, but it should work for this. Now, just like I did on the main tensioner, I'm going to actuate this as if I'm tightening a bolt. You can see it releases the tension, and I should be able to slip the belt off. Now, in order to actually do this, I'm going to need my other hand, so I'm going to put you guys down for this. So here's a look at the air conditioning belt now that I have it off the truck. You can see that this one's actually in worse shape than the main Serpentine belt. It's got a lot more cracking and checking, and even some of the pieces of it are kind of missing. So definitely time to replace this one. So it's going to be a little bit of a tight fit, especially on the side that's behind the lines there, but I'm going to use my 15mm socket and remove those bolts. Okay, so here's a look at the old air conditioning tensioner. Now when I spin the pulley, you can hear that it sounds kind of rough, and you probably can't see it in the camera, but I can wiggle this a little bit back and forth, and it's definitely loose. So not completely all the way shot, but close to it. So let's take a quick look at the new tensioner. I got this and all of the parts that I'm using today from my local Napa store. Here's a look at the part number. I'll leave a link to all these parts down in the description below as well, in case you want to see a little more detail on them. So here's a look at the two tensioners side by side. Obviously the old one on the left and the new one on the right. They look pretty much identical. I can't see any differences here. And I can also see that on the old one it is stamped Made in Canada, and the new one is also stamped Made in Canada. So they were probably both made in the same factory, or at least presumably. And unlike the old tensioner, this pulley is nice and tight and doesn't make any noises when I spin it. So let's go ahead and throw this one on the truck. Okay, installation is going to be pretty much the opposite of removal. I'm just going to reuse the two bolts that were in there and bolt this back up where the old one was. Okay, so there's a look at the new tensioner in place and ready to go. Next up, I'll put the new air conditioning belt on. So here's a look at the new air conditioner belt. We're going to put this on next. And again, it's from Napa, and if you want to see the details on it, there's a link down in the description below. So here's a look at the belt after I've installed it on the engine. Now, installation was pretty much the opposite of removal. I brought my ratchet with the extension back on, put it in that hole in the tensioner, released the tension from the tensioner, and got the belt worked around the pulleys. So the real difficulty here isn't so much the belt routing. You can see it just goes around the engine crank pulley, and then over there the air conditioning compressor, and then of course around the tensioner. The real trick here was just the fact that there's not a whole lot of room to work with, and then I only had one hand free while I had the tensioner deactivated to kind of route the belt. But it wasn't too difficult, only took a few minutes, got it in place, and I think we're ready to go on to the next step. So we're now back up and looking at the top side of the engine, and I'm going to work on removing the main Serpentine belt tensioner here. Now, I don't think there's really anything wrong with the tensioner, but I'm going to replace it anyway while I've got the belt off, just as a preventative maintenance measure. This engine does have 200,000 miles on it, and it would be just my luck to replace the belt and then a month from now have that tensioner fail. So we'll just do it all now and get it out of the way. So there's just two bolts holding the tensioner on, one up here and one down there. So I'm going to grab my 15mm socket and remove those. So as it turns out, there's a hidden bolt here on the left side of the tensioner that I didn't see at first. So we'll just have to crack that one off before we can remove this. Okay, so as you can see, we've got the tensioner off the truck. So it's worth noting that not all of these bolts are the same. The top bolt and the bottom left bolt are the longer shoulder bolts, and the bottom right bolt is the short one. So here's a look at the new tensioner. You may not be able to see the part number there, but it is 38158, and again, just like the other parts, there's a link down in the description below to the Napa page for this part. Okay, so here's a look at the two tensioners side by side, the old one over here, the new one over here. Now I can't tell from the old one because it's somewhat corroded, but the new one is stamped Made in Canada, just like the air conditioner tension was. So that's a good thing. Now the old tensioner seems like it's in okay shape. I don't feel any signs of looseness or rattling or anything like that. Anyway, let's get the new tensioner mounted on the engine. Okay, so as you can no doubt see, I've got the new tensioner mounted to the engine, and we're ready to move on to the next step, which is going to be to replace this idler pulley here. So just like the tensioner, this pulley is in decent shape. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but I'm going to replace it just as a preventative measure. So to remove the idler pulley, you can see I've just got my 15mm socket and my breaker bar on the bolt that's in the center of the pulley, and we should be able to just loosen this up and remove it. Okay, easy as that. Okay, so here's a look at the new idler. You can see the part number here, and just as before, there is a link down in the description below if you want to see the Napa product page for this part. So here's a look at the parts side by side. The new one is on the left and the old one is on the right. The design of them is a little bit different. Now they are both the same diameter pulley, but this one uses a slightly different bearing arrangement. You can see that in this case, this large front washer and the back shaft all kind of spin together. Whereas on the new part, the washer and bearing are sort of inset in the front and in the back, and you can kind of see this spins independently of this. Now in my hands, the old one feels slightly heavier and maybe just a little bit more robust than the new design. However, I am going to go ahead and throw the new one on since I have it. Now one other thing about the new one, you can see that just like the other parts, it was made in Canada. Okay, so I'm going to put the new idler pulley in where the old one was. And it's just a matter of getting the bolt in and tightened up. Okay, so we've come to the part of the video that everyone's probably been waiting for, and that's reinstallation of the Serpentine Belt. So here's a look at the new belt and part number that I got from Napa, and just like all the other parts, there is a link down in the description that will take you to the Napa product page if you want to see more details. So routing that belt wasn't quite as difficult as I thought it might be. I've got it routed around all of the pulleys except for the tensioner pulley. You can see I've just got it kind of against the nut here. So what I'm going to do now is bring back my breaker bar with the 15mm socket, and we'll relieve the tension from the tensioner and get the belt over this last pulley. So the trick here is to keep the belt wrapped around the socket so it's around the wrench. That way when I remove the tension from the tensioner, the wrench isn't in the way. Okay, so with the tension off of the tensioner, I was able to slip the belt over that pulley. Just going to check and make sure that the belt is centered on all of the rest of the pulleys before I let go of the tensioner and tension the belt. Okay, that ought to do it. I think we're ready to start reassembling all of the plastics here. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is put the fan shroud back in. So I'm going to maneuver that under the hoses and get it aligned up to the bottom half of the fan shroud that's still there in the engine. So you may be able to see here, I've got the two halves of the fan shroud mated together. Now on either side of the shroud there are pins on the lower half of the shroud that go through alignment holes in the top half. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring back these 4 plastic clips and just put them through the holes here like this. And then once they're through the holes in both halves, I'll push that pin down in the middle and that'll lock everything together. So next up, I'll get the fan shroud lined up so that those holes in those tabs line up with the threaded holes in the radiator support, and then I'll install these screws using my 10mm socket. Next up, what I'll do is make sure that all of the hose clips are placed back where they belong in the fan shroud. Okay, and then last up with the fan shroud, I'll just spin the fan a few times and make sure there's no interference between the fan and the shroud. So next up, I'm going to bring back the intake tube and reorient that on the engine. This end here is going to go to the intake plenum, and this end here is going to go to the air box. So now that I've got everything lined up, I'm just going to tighten up these hose clamps to lock it in place. Now I'll bring back the top engine cover, get it lined up in position here, and then we'll put this one bolt back in place using my 8mm socket. Okay, so I think we're almost done. The last couple things I need to do is get that skid plate mounted back on and put that plastic splash pan back on the front. So I'll crawl underneath and do that now. And the last thing I need to do before I start this up and make sure everything is okay is to reconnect the battery. So I've got everything put back together, so now it's the moment of truth. Let's start this thing up and see what it sounds like. That's pretty much going to wrap things up for replacement of the Serpentine belts and tensioners on this 2004 Chevy Tahoe. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to leave a comment or subscribe, feel free to do that as well. And don't forget, if you want to see details about the parts that I used in this video, check the description below for links to those product pages. Thanks for watching.